Anne Frank. Happy Birthday, Anne. Chapter 1. June 12, 1942, was the 13th birthday of Anne Frank. Her home at 37 Merwede Square in Amsterdam was filled with flowers as Anne sat down to open her presents. She received books, jewelry, a game, and a puzzle. There were more chocolates and other candies. Anne also received some money that she could spend as she wished. Right away, Anne made up her mind. She would buy herself still another book, one about Greek and Roman mythology. Anne was a lively girl with lots of friends. She loved to go skating and to play with her classmates, but she loved reading too. Among her gifts, there was a book with a red and white checked cover. Inside, the pages were blank. It was a diary in which Anne could record her own story. Probably, Anne also received a poem that her father had written in honor of the event. It was a family tradition, and Anne and her older sister Margaret looked forward to those verses that he wrote for them on special occasions. He wrote his verses in German. The Frank family lived in Holland, but it was only natural for Otto Frank to write his poems in German. He had been born and educated in Germany. In fact, the whole family, both parents and Anne and Margaret, had been born in Germany. During the First World War, Otto Frank had served in the German army and had become a lieutenant. When Otto married Edith Hollander in 1925, they settled in Frankfurt, Germany. He assumed they would live there for the rest of their lives. After all, Otto's ancestors had lived in that city as far back as the 17th century. In 1926, the Franks' first daughter, Margaret, was born. 3 years later, on June 12, 1929, their second daughter was born. She was named Anneliese Mary. It was a long name for a baby, and before long she was just called Anne. Although the Frank family was German, it was also Jewish. In 1929, Frankfurt was the home of about 30,000 Jews among a total population of 540,000 people. After Berlin, it was the second largest Jewish community in all of Germany. At one time, there had been rules singling out the Jewish people and forcing them to live in a separate area called the ghetto. But since the beginning of the 19th century, new laws said that the Jews were equal to all other people in Germany. They could live and work as they pleased. With such a long history of acceptance and opportunity behind them, it was no wonder that the Franks looked forward to a long and happy life in Frankfurt. But even though in 1929, when Anne was born, was a time of celebrating for Otto and Edith Frank, it was not a good year for Germany. Many businesses closed, and as a result, thousands of people were out of work. 1/4 of Frankfurt's population was unemployed. A new political party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, had been formed after the First World War. As time grew worse, more and more people supported this party. These supporters blamed the bad times in Germany on a weak government and on the Jews. It was not the first time in history that the Jews were blamed for something they had not done. Anti-Semitism had come and gone before. Edith and Otto Frank and the other Jews around them hoped that, with time, this ill feeling toward them would be forgotten. But as the economic situation got worse, the Nazis became stronger. In an election in 1933, Adolf Hitler, the party's leader, was elected as the head of a government made up of several political parties. 2 months later, he seized total power. All the other political parties in the country were outlawed, and those people who opposed the Nazi party were sent to prison camps. With Hitler firmly in power, anti-Semitism became official government policy. Laws were passed that did not allow the Germans to shop in stores owned by Jews. It was forbidden for people who were not Jewish to consult a Jewish doctor or a Jewish lawyer. Furthermore, physical attacks against Jews in the streets were common. By mid-April 1933, a law passed stating that all public employees who had even one Jewish grandparent were to be fired from their jobs. Jewish teachers were not permitted to teach in the schools. As Jews lost their jobs, there was more work for pure Christian Germans. The Nazis called these Germans Aryans. Suddenly, the Franks found that they were not Germans after all. They were Jews. And because of that, they were hated. Most of the Jews living in Germany tried to convince themselves that these new laws would not last. How could more than 100 years of acceptance be undone in just a few weeks? It was difficult for men who had served in the country's army and had fought for Germany in the last war to believe that they were not true citizens. Surely the madness of the Nazis was just a passing phase in German history. Some Jews, however, realized that Germany was no longer a safe place in which to live and raise their families, and Otto Frank was one of them. In 1933, when the Nazis seized power, he left Frankfurt and went to Amsterdam, Holland. He had often gone there on business trips. There, he set up a branch of a German company. His wife and daughters joined him months later, and a new life in a new country began for Anne and her family. Holland is famous for its great religious tolerance and acceptance of all people. In the 17th century, the pilgrims who were to become some of the first American settlers traveled first to Holland before they boarded the Mayflower and came to the New World. And still earlier, in 1492, Jews fleeing from the Spanish Inquisition had also found a friendly home in Holland. By 1933, when the Frank family arrived in Amsterdam, there were more than 100,000 Jews living in Holland. Since half of the number made their home in Amsterdam, it was no wonder that some people called the city Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of Europe. And it was no wonder that Otto Frank was confident that he had made a wise choice in moving his family to Holland, away from the Nazis and the anti-Semitism of Germany. To move to a new country and to learn a new language and customs are not easy, but Otto Frank's business thrived, and he made good friends among his Dutch colleagues. And Margot and Anne were so young that they adapted to the new home without problems. They learned to speak Dutch. The girls were enrolled at the Montessori school, which was just a few blocks from their home. They quickly made friends. In Anne's class, there were 13 other Jewish children. Some were refugees from Germany, just like Anne. Although it rains 175 days a year in Amsterdam, the life was sunny and happy for Anne and her family. The good times, however, did not last. The influence of Hitler and the Nazis began to be felt outside of Germany. It was a Nazi plan to conquer all of Europe. First, Austria was taken over by Germany. Next, Czechoslovakia was conquered by the Germans and was no longer an independent country. Then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. Holland had been a neutral country during the First World War, and many Dutch people expected that during this new war, Holland will again remain neutral. But the war was coming closer all the time. Within 6 months, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Then on May 10, 1940, Germany invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and Holland. The invasion of Holland came as a complete surprise. The Dutch were unprepared to defend themselves against a country so much larger than they were. Within days, the country was forced to surrender. Holland was occupied by the Germans. Dutch government officials and the Dutch royal family fled to England. For the rest of the Dutch people, there was no possibility of fleeing. Many Dutchmen were forced to go to Germany and work in the factories. Those who remained in Holland found themselves governed by a new German laws. Just like in Germany, strict regulations that dealt with Jewish citizens were enforced. All Jewish had to sew a yellow six-pointed star on their clothing. Anne was forbidden to run errands for her mother except the hours of 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. She could only go into stores that had the sign Jewish shop. She could not be outside after 8 o'clock at night, not even in her own garden. Anne and Margot could not go to the movies or play tennis or go swimming. They could not ride on a train, eat in a restaurant, or visit openly with their Christian friends. Wooden signs announcing, Bordeaux, Joden, Bordeaux, forbidden for Jews, were posted almost everywhere. Perhaps saddest of all, 12-year-old Anne was forced to leave the Montessori school. She wept when she said goodbye to her teacher. Anne and Margot enrolled in the Jewish secondary school. Although they were joined by their Jewish classmates, they left behind many good friends. And they were well aware that this change in their education was still another of the dreadful events that were going on throughout the country, events that affected them and the other Jews in Holland. And it was all caused by the insane hatred that the German Nazi felt toward Jews. Still, Anne's father tried hard to protect his daughters from fully realizing just how desperate the situation was for Jews. And that's why Anne's 13th birthday was celebrated with all the festivities that she had come to anticipate. Anne was a good student and got along well with most of the teachers at her new school, but she often talked in class to her friends. One day, the math teacher became so irritated by Anne's constant talking that he gave her a special punishment. She had to write a composition about a chatterbox. Undaunted, Anne proved to her teacher that her words could flow as fluently on the page as they did when she spoke. She wrote that talking is a feminine characteristic, and although she might work to keep it under control, she did not think she could be cured. Furthermore, she wrote that her mother talked just as much as she did, and so being a chatterbox was undoubtedly an inherited characteristic. The math teacher laughed at Anne's composition, and all was well until the next time Anne began to chatter in class. A second report was assigned, now entitled Incurable Chatterbox. Again, Anne succeeded in filling the composition pages for her teacher, but when she still continued talking a few days later, she scolded her with disgust. Anne, as punishment for talking, will do a composition entitled Quack, 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 says Mr. Natterbrick. He announced to the students. Everyone in Anne's math class roared with laughter, and Anne had to laugh, too. She was rescued from the ridiculous assignment by her friend Zane, who offered to write a poem for Anne. The poem was about 3 baby ducklings who were beaten to death by their swamp father because they chattered too much. The math teacher read the poem aloud to the class and shared it with the other classes too. After that, he ignored Anne's chattering in class. He knew he couldn't change her. For a girl as bright and as imaginative as Anne was, and who could express herself so readily on paper, a diary was a wonderful birthday gift. So when Anne discovered the red and white checked book among her birthday gifts, she was delighted. She promised herself that she would write in the book regularly. Even though she had several good friends, Liz and Joppy and Zane, she considered the new diary to be her closest friend. She decided that she would call this new and private friend Kitty, and that the entries she wrote in the diary would be in the form of letters. She would be able to tell Kitty personal things that she had never shared with her real life friends or with her mother or sister. She could write whatever she wished because it was unlikely that anyone else would ever read what she wrote. After all, Anne thought as she began to fill the blank pages of her diary. Who would possibly be interested in the words of a 13-year-old schoolgirl? The first entry was dated Sunday, June 14th, 1942, and began by describing her birthday.